the reservations here, sovereign laws, and um, when folks want to leave the reservation, the challenge is in many cases they're cut off from the social networks, and if they fall into a tough situation, it can be they can be more easily taken advantage of because they're socially isolated. I haven't looked at trafficking around the reservations very much. I don't doubt that it exists. There's actually a colleague of mine, Aaron Huey, has done a lot of work with some of the reservations in South Dakota, and actually just had the longest ever piece in National Geographic on that, National Geographic magazine. And again, you're talking about high rates of alcoholism, high rates of drug use, talking about social isolation. All these things can lead to trafficking. But in order for somebody to really be trafficked under law, under U.S. law, they have to be recruited, transported, or harbored, and for the purpose of forcing them to work under threat of violence for no pay beyond subsistence. So if they're not, if folks, you can volunteer to work in something and not be paid, and it's not slavery. The key thing is, can you walk away? If you can't walk away, then there's a whole lot of different forms of labor that we can classify accurately as slavery or trafficking by virtue of the fact that people just can't walk away from it. Certain industries lend themselves more to it than others. Fishing is a classic one. I mean, if you're between 12 and 200 miles offshore and in one of these deep sea fishing vessels, and they were actually Korean foreign charter vessels that I was referring to earlier, where these Indonesian slaves had been recruited under false pretenses, and then when they got on board the ships, they said, we're not paying you anything. At the end of 2 years, we'll give you $500. But in the meantime, gross physical abuse, verbal abuse, and something I didn't expect to find, given the fact that it was all male crews and all male officers, that there was endemic sexual abuse as a means to sort of subjugate these folks, and all this took place, again, between 12 and 200 miles offshore. So even though the place where they would come into port was New Zealand, which is a country with a pretty good rule of law, pretty strong respect for human rights, the workers were told, if you try running away and the New Zealand authorities catch you, what's going to happen is you're going to be deported. You're going to be brought back to Indonesia, and then when you're back there, if you've spoken out, the agents will find you, and they'll seize your property, and they'll send your family into hiding. And they meant business. And I talked to one young woman who was in hiding. Found her through a network. It was really kind of a journalistic coup to actually track her down. But it was a situation where she hadn't even been on board the ship, but her husband had. Her husband had ran, and then she was basically vulnerable because the agents wanted to get back at the runaway. So yeah, I mean, I'd be really curious to. You should look it up. I'm sure there's some research on trafficking around the reservations, and it wouldn't at all surprise me if it's endemic. You're talking about lower rates of overall development, higher rates of alcoholism and drug use, and sadly a great degree of social isolation. There's a lot of injustice surrounding the way we treated our native population. Please.
Earlier you mentioned a state within a state, and because this is a history class, we're talking about like early colonial America,
yeah.
And even today, like for example, the Dutch and the Dutch East India Company, that was sort of like a state within a state.
Yeah, yeah.
And whenever you have a state within a state, like even today, corporations are getting bigger in America, and it's sort of a rising thing.
Yeah.
And usually, state within the states, I know that they're like pretty economically okay. Like they do well with money, but I feel like legally, morally, and like ethically, they sort of stray away. And do you think like a lot of state within the states? Do you think that's more likely that there's going to be slavery?
I think it all depends. To be clear, I'm really talking about a nation within a nation, not necessarily a state within a state. And with the Romani, we're talking about unwritten laws, and it's not like they have their own. Well, I guess they sort of have their own justice. They certainly have their own justice system, but it's not like they have their own postal service and all this kind of thing. We're talking about populations, and in other cases, we're talking about the Dalit, for example, who are the Dalit is what used to be called the untouchable caste in India and throughout South Asia, and you're talking about people who have been cast out by literally they're outcast. They're not part of the caste system. They were historically confined to a whole range of work that upper caste populations wouldn't touch, and they have lived that way for centuries. Now officially caste is abolished in India. In reality, those caste distinctions are still very active and they're still very pernicious. And even though the guy that wrote the Indian Constitution was officially Dalit, he was Dalit, and so the Indian Constitution is extremely progressive. The problem is at the federal level, the laws, the Supreme Court, all the good ideas that they have don't necessarily get enforced at the local level because it's a very weak federal state, and in places like Logradal, this hamlet that I was describing where Ganu lived, it's really the rule of the gun, and the people with the most power tend to be Brahmin caste, and the Dalits, the only real cohesive identity that they have is as this crushed, oppressed caste who is serving, who has no rights, and frankly, there was a vested interest at the local level in keeping them socially isolated and ignorant of their rights. Officially, Ganu and others could go to the district magistrate and say, hey, I've been held in death bondage. We've all been held in death bondage. Here's the situation, and they could apply and go through the whole process of this, getting reparations under Indian law. In reality, it just doesn't happen. Primarily, it doesn't happen because of the threat of violence. Secondarily, it doesn't happen because of the relationship of dependence. And third, it doesn't happen for the reason you're alluding to. They feel that they are objects under law rather than the subjects of law, and it's that caste system is very pernicious and keeps going despite its evolution.
I just wanted it's easier for me to do because I've been doing it for so long, but I want you to listen for some of the patterns. Like think of the American South. Think of weak federal government. Like a federal authority. There's no federal authority in the situation you described to put a hand of a more universal set of values. We've defined politics as the authoritative allocation of value, and we talk about the tension between sometimes provincial values, where slavery might just be fine, and we've got all the power. and a more universal set of values, like, sorry, we don't do slavery here. That is a federal imposition. And I heard you describe lots of that pattern.
Yeah, and it's fascinating. And India today, and America in Reconstruction is a fascinating parallel. And there's a lot going on there. And India, Indian officials at all levels really have to make a choice what kind of development they want. And I think slavery. I think you were making this point. Slavery is really lost productivity. It's interesting. One of the things I've been getting into recently with my girlfriend, who's much more devout than I am, has been the looking at how one particular kind of unifier of culture, which is faith, has addressed slavery, or how people of faith have addressed slavery through their faith. And my relatives going way back were Quakers. So they were among the earliest Quakers in the country. Going back to the colonial era, on my mother's side anyway, and they were, we have these documents where they're trafficking, they're railing against the traffic in men body, and there was debate among Quakers as well about whether to exclude slaveholders from the Quaker meeting, and it took a while to actually get to the point where they're like, this is completely anathema. This is an abomination. We can't have this in the meeting. And at the same time, there was, of course, a very prominent denomination, which today is one of the largest evangelical, in fact, I think is the largest evangelical denomination, the Southern Baptist Convention, which argued that slavery was a Bible institution, and they went to Paul, slaves obey thy masters, and it's interesting because I've spoken in churches, and it's always one of these difficult questions to wrestle with, where my girlfriend likes to say, well, the teachings of Christ are clearly abolitionist in their meaning. And I said, well, we didn't actually talk about slavery per se, and it's a challenging subject. And in a situation like India at the local level, again, religion is very much used as a normative sort of means of keeping people in their caste, keeping people in their place. But Gandhi, of course, used it the other way around. So I think the challenge is to harness these communities of faith, to work with them, and to kind of see that, to allow them to see, well, perhaps a finer understanding of this is one that would say we should be working on behalf of the least among us.
That was that rise of fascism. A guy named Eric Fromm, who I paid some attention to when I was young, he asked this question: how does a Christian country like Germany become a fascist state? How does that happen? You get into the psychology you were talking before.
I think injustice, when injustice is justified by religion, people drift away from religion. And in the case of East Germany, it was fascinating. Of course, there we're talking about a state that was formed, East Germany, right after this fascist state, this Nazi state, where religion, I think, had become kind of become strictly nationalized, and and it was because people had such a strong reaction against Nazism and had this sense of, gosh, we were wholly defeated here. I think that the brutality of communism found fertile ground, and particularly the atheist leanings. And now it's interesting. Religion in Germany is it's a real kind of mixed bag. You get some of the oldest.
Is it going back a little bit?
A little bit, yeah. Although it strikes me as being quite regional.
People are getting curious again about.
I don't know. It's kind of fall over.
Yeah.
Anyway, we've got a little.
Yeah, other
little
questions?
earlier.
Excuse me, do you think, like, when in your context of this thing that in India, the religion, how it's actually against, like, don't you think poverty is actually the main problem in places like, say, I'm from Bangladesh, and actually the main reason that exists, the single most, is poverty.
Yeah.
That's like, you can say it 3 times, poverty.
Yeah.
And that's why, like, a parent would give away their 10-year-old girl because they cannot feed that child because they have 10 more.
Yeah.
So it's like, and to be honest with you, like, though Bangladesh is actually a Muslim country,
Yeah.
but religion has little to do with that.
Of course. Yeah.
And again, so I think it's like, and when you talk about the supply chain, and again, I like to bring Bangladesh into that because of all the recent exposure
course,
because
yeah.
of garment industry and all that.
Yeah.
And growing up there, I have seen, it's like, so you can look at all the labels and made in Bangladesh, and to increase awareness that, like, I'm not going to buy any product because what they're doing.
That doesn't necessarily help.
Exactly, that doesn't really solve the problem.
Yeah.
Because again, when you hear the story about one building collapsing, you don't hear about, like, 10 others that actually provide employment.
Absolutely, and the women that work in these factories are the primary wage earners.
Bread earners,
Yeah.
exactly. And they're like, there are good garment industry that provide childcare, that provide school,
Yeah.
that provide, like, snacks for these kids.
Yeah.
And, like, so I think the problem, the grassroots of the problem is, again, self-power.
Yeah.
Like, if you can educate these people, provide employment, not necessarily, like, being at the end of the supply chain.
Yeah, I mean, unquestionably, you're right. I mean, to deny, as certain folks were trying to do in this country, when the Trafficking Victims Protection Act was coming into place 13 years ago, to deny the importance of aid in fighting slavery, to deny the importance of anti-poverty initiatives, to deny the importance of poverty in slavery is like denying the importance of gravity and rainfall. I mean, it is an absolute driver. Are there odd instances where somebody who's upper middle class, who has a very comfortable life and a good background, gets somehow seduced or even kidnapped, a la the movie Taken or something like this? Sure, they're extremely isolated. For the most part, we're talking about people that have no other resources, that are socially isolated, that are extremely poor, and parents who are making a devil's choice between watching their children slowly starve or die of a preventable disease, or giving them away to somebody who doesn't identify themselves as a trafficker, but says, I'm a friend, I'm a broker, I'm a recruiter, whatever. But in the case of Bangladesh is a fascinating case to me because obviously since the War of Independence there's been this extraordinary microfinance boom in Bangladesh, really unprecedented throughout the rest of the world. Last week at the Clean Global Initiative, I haven't really talked about what I'm doing now, but I just, this may come as a shock to the system, but I just founded a private equity firm that is going in and taking significant minority stakes in companies that have social and environmental problems, including trafficking, exposure to trafficking, including safety issues. And we are going in with usually about $50 or $100 million dollars, and taking a 5 to 20% stake in these companies and turning them around, and then plugging them back into the supply chains of retailers. After we've given the workers a better access to a more dignified existence, access to childcare, access to reasonable housing where they're not exploited by landlords, et cetera, and cleaned up the environmental issues so that they're not, we're not dumping toxic effluents into drinking water and things like that. And Bangladesh, it was a theater, the garment industry in Bangladesh in particular was the theater that we've been looking at for about a year before Rana Plaza. And I've been working in stealth mode for a while on the side, building this thing up. And we publicly launched last week at the Clinton Global Initiative. And there was we made an announcement, a commitment to invest $1 billion to upgrade the whole garment industry in this regard. And among others on the panel was Fazal Abed, Sir Fazal Abed, who's the founder of BRAC. And we hadn't actually coordinated beforehand, but Clinton brought us together and put us on this panel together. And he was, it was interesting. His take on it was the Western countries just have to pay more for the garments. I think there's actually an alternative, which is, we think there's an alternative, which is invest to upgrade, specifically to upgrade the means of production, so that the workers are given a fair deal. They're incentivized to work harder by virtue of the potential pay increases. They're not slapped around by their supervisors. Children's academic performance, the children of the workers, their academic performance is incentivized instead of the children, coming to work with their parents, which in many cases is their only option for childcare. You work with local partners, and Bangladesh is blessed with a tremendous, microfinance infrastructure. There are challenges there. It's far from perfect, but it's something to work with. The bottom line for me has always been, in Bangladesh, you don't see the aggregate rates of slavery and debt bondage that you do in India. Why? Because extremely poor people have an option of credit, which may be, by some critics say that it's exploited interest rates, but it's more or less formalized. And there is this bank for the poor, as it were, that isn't available for many of the populations in India. And I think there's a model there. And going back to your original point, religion really has nothing to do with it. There's a situation where, my best friend is Bangladeshi, and a lot of our team members are Bangladeshi and have worked for Grameen and have worked for on various projects around the garment sector. And my best friend is a big defender, and he says, well, religion does have something to do with it because the caste system is abolished. The truth of the matter is, in a place like Pakistan, there is still, there's still the landless, which is sort of a de facto caste system. You don't have the same kind of microfinance. And so, again, whether or not religion has anything to do with it, there still is the hangover of the caste system in Pakistan, which you don't see so much in Bangladesh.
Yeah, it's because, I guess in Bangladesh there's no caste, but there's classes
based
on economy.
And within these these factory groups, you see that where there's no middle management right now. There's the owners
who are extremely affluent,
who are extremely wealthy,
extremely affluent. But
and our argument to them is, the 50 to 100 million that we're coming in with here, this is going to be, you're not going to buy your Ferrari with this. You're going to give us a couple of board seats, You need access to capital. Oh, and on the hard side, if you don't do this, you're going to be on Walmart's red list, and you're going to be out of business, and you're going to go into liquidation, and your kids aren't going to go to Harvard. So, you know, you can take you can buy your Ferrari, you can pay for your kids' education out of the profits, but our money is going to go to upgrading the situation of the workers. We'll see. It's an experience, it's a grand experiment. But anyway, let me open up the floor to more questions about it.
Yeah, I just wanted to clarify too. My assertion is not that it's religion that affects, but it is people's values. And I think any time a group of people gets comfortable with exploiting a certain group of people because they're not like us, which I'm worried about happening in our country right now, because we've got sort of a permanent the growth of what could be seen as a bit of a permanent underclass, generations of people who haven't searched for work, and if the rest of us get real comfortable with they're not like us, I worry. And where you get, that's what my question for you then was, after studying the rise of fascism in Europe, what fascinated me were any of the attitudes on a tiny, tiny scale, in our daily life. I could treat you in a way that really is the seed of that kind of attitude. Just the way I treat you. It cultivates in me a readiness for something like fascism when stuff hits the fan.
Yeah.
And I was wondering what are the attitudes that you've encountered that allow people to live with these fairly comfortably with such atrocity?
Right.
And the other thing I would assert is that while you're taking an economic approach to poverty, it's his values that are making him do it. Other people don't have those values, and they're not doing it.
And other people take a strictly economic approach, and I mean, some of these fishery owners, they argued in front of Parliament, in front of special committees of Parliament, that they had to use the foreign charter vessel system because if they had to, if they were forced to pay New Zealand minimum wage to fishermen, they wouldn't be able to compete with China. So they were using a very strictly economic argument to justify what turned out to be slavery, a system that allowed slavery. And the many of the those that were involved with the Confederacy made the same argument that this is the only way that we remain economically viable is through slavery. We're built on this. Well, guess what? They were wrong, and so were the people that made the economic argument a year ago in New Zealand. They were wrong. They lost millions of dollars, and my feeling is sometimes you have to hurt business in order. There are some, paraphrasing Cool Hand Luke, there are some companies that you just can't reach through conversation. You got to show them that there is a real economic downside to doing the wrong thing, to using slave labor. So, and Adam Smith, the original describer of capitalism, had a great quote in Wealth of Nations where he said, "Slavery is the dearest form of all labors," meaning the most expensive form, because only through sheer violence, through sheer force, in other words, this extraordinary exertion of energy and attention, can you extract the labor from a slave whose only interest is in avoiding being beaten and in getting just enough to eat. Whereas if you incentivize workers, this isn't Adam Smith, this is me paraphrasing Adam Smith. If you incentivize workers to work harder, you allow them to own a portion at least of the products of their own labor. They will work harder. They will be more productive. They will stick around after they're trained. I mean, the big problem in the Bangladeshi garment sector in terms of labor is an average garment factory has about 10 to 15% migration rates, what they call migration rates, where they lose their workers as soon as they train them because they go to another place where they can get a couple of taka more. And if you can reduce that, in other words, make them happy, you get more productive workers whose value per minute is higher. And in many cases you can reduce that just by giving them a sense of community and by giving them, certainly by giving them housing, as opposed to obliging them to live in some slum where a unscrupulous landlord will take 80% of their income. So anyway, it's a and on the value side, to your question, you see the casual elements of discrimination in everyday folks that don't own slaves, but you see how that gives cover to those that want to really exploit people through trafficking. So we're talking about when I was in Romania, you see everyday Romanians who don't own slaves and maybe don't even go and sleep with prostitutes, but they have this attitude towards the Roma that they are criminals, they are lower than the low, and there's a whole history to this, and I write about it in the book. Under Ceausescu tried to flip the social order. It didn't work. It just bred a lot of even more resentment against the Romani population. But in the Dominican Republic, I took a motorcycle across when I was working in Haiti and went to the Bates. So as you guys know, on the island of Hispaniola, there's Haiti and there's the DR. You couldn't have, two totally different. You couldn't have more stark difference in terms of economic development, well, maybe Mexico and the United States. I find there are a lot of examples of that, but Mexico and the United States is another good example where Mexicans in this country who are here, who are not regular migrants, in other words, are undocumented. Same with Haitians in the Dominican Republic who are undocumented. Extraordinarily likely to be, higher than average percentage of them are trafficked. According to the DOJ numbers, Mexico is the #1 source country for trafficking victims in the United States. Certainly in the DR, #1 source is Haiti. But the principal narrative about all of those populations is, these are people that are trying to game the system. They're coming here illegally, and it becomes this kind of deportation thing. And so when traffickers are bringing these folks into the country, they say, hey, if you go to the authorities, guess what's going to happen? You're going to be taken to an ICE facility, you're going to be processed for deportation, and when you get back to Mexico, when you get back to the village, we're going to take our due, and if we can't find you, we'll come after your family. And too often, that's what's happened. There's a real value question there in law enforcement, and I think lost in the immigration debate and lost in those debates about values in society and how we relate to one another is the sad fact that kind of exploitation does take place and is enabled by law enforcement that I think too often doesn't look for the least among us, but looks for perpetrators when they should be looking for victims.
Can they catch them red-handed? Is that what they have to do to stop it? I mean, you wonder what can that person do if you go to the authorities and they say we have to prove it?
Yeah, and it's really hard to prove because you have to prove force, fraud, or coercion under U.S. law, a victim can say, hey, I was compelled to work, et cetera, et cetera. A perpetrator can say, well, I have these, see this document, we hung this code of conduct in the factory, and it said, everybody
not
had,
do this.
well, yeah, but it also says, everybody has the right to such and such and such and such. But the workers would have been told, never mind that. We know where your families are. You owe us for transportation. You owe us for housing, et cetera, et cetera. And so, the perpetrators know how to game the system.